All right. It's go time, friends. Episode 45 of Red versus Blue. My name is Mike Stark.
And I'm Keith Curry.
We're down to it, Keith.
The final week, 4 days from now, the votes will be all in hand. It appears as though Harris has stopped slipping in the polls, that Trump has stopped rising. They have both now sort of stabilized at pretty much even all across the country, all across the battleground states. So as we go into this last week, the Trump campaign asked itself, this is too easy. What can we do to make this a more challenging election for us? So let's invite a comic that nobody's ever heard of to come to Madison Square Garden, where, by the way, in 1939, 1940, the old America First had a rally in support of staying out of the war in Europe. And let's have this guy insult Puerto Rican voters, who are a major voting group, not only in Pennsylvania, but in 4 other swing states, and have that dominate the news for the week. And while we're at it, let's announce that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he of Worm Brain and Roadkill, will be allowed to run wild on health and food policy. Now, I can see this now. We're going to have roadkill on the menu in every school cafeteria in America with this guy in charge.
Yum.
And by the way, while we're at it, let's put Liz Cheney in front of a firing squad, because that's just how we roll in this campaign. And Nikki Haley has been saying to the world that she wants to campaign with us, but if she does, I'd have to be nice to her, and I'm not about to do that. So we're not going to go anywhere near Nikki Haley. Let's see how that sits with the voters as we go into the last week of decision making. That was the Trump campaign strategy. Does it make any sense? No, not at all. But there it is.
Okay. Did they do anything right this week?
Well, occasionally he talks about the economy and the border. Those are issues that he's beating Harris on by 20 points. About 55 minutes into his speech, he mentions that. And he should do more of that. But, it's amazing that the race is tied, given all of these self-sabotaging efforts of Trump himself to lose.
All right. So you pretty well summed up the Trump status at this point. And really, it didn't move the needle all that much when you look at it. What about Harris? Was she able to move the needle at all?
Harris gave what I thought was the best speech of her campaign on the Ellipse in Washington. Estimates of between 45 and 75,000 people were there to hear it. With the possible exception of the reproductive rights part, that speech could have been given by Ronald Reagan. And in fact, in 1967, when Reagan signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act in California, he could have given all of the speech. It was a good speech. It laid her out as a person of being conciliatory to try and bring the nation together. I'm afraid, however, it in fact did not bring her a lot of support in the polls, did not help a tremendous amount. And of course, she was hurt because Joe Biden, after she's given this message of conciliation, comes out and calls Trump supporters garbage. Now, he says he misspoke, and we all understand that Joe Biden misspeaks a lot. But nonetheless, that sort of stepped on her lines for the week.
Right.
And so, we're stumbling, bumbling, rumbling into the election day with 2 very flawed candidates who have run very flawed campaigns that could all be criticized extensively looking back over the last 100 days.
And you can do that through our podcast. After it's all over, you can go back to episode 1 and listen all the way through and hear the progression of this whole craziness, right?
Absolutely. Now, there are a couple of developments. It appears that she is running better with independents, and that could be the difference in this race, because nobody really knows how they're going to break. They appear to be, based on preliminary indications, breaking for her. We have thought, because the early vote turnout was higher, that maybe we're going to have another record vote turnout. But now it appears that we're not going to reach the levels that we had in 2020. Now, who does that help? The conventional wisdom thinking is that these low propensity voters are young men voting for Trump, and if they don't show up, that helps Harris. We really don't know at this point, but it's something that we need to look at. Democrats generally look to be leading across the board in early vote, except in Nevada and in North Carolina, where Republicans are doing better than before. But everywhere, Republicans are voting more in early voting than they had 4 years ago. Now, that also means that there will be a less of a Republican margin on Election Day because those people have already voted.
Right.
So how will this all come out in the wash? Well, we don't really know yet. It remains to be seen.
Now, there are some new polls out, but at this point, do the polls mean anything?
The polls are so close. Everything is within the margin of error. What the polls are telling us is that this is going to be a very, very close election. It could go either way, that all of the battleground states are still in play, are still winnable by either candidate. One candidate could run the table with them. They could split them 3-4. It's anybody's election, and we just don't know yet.
Right. Now, we're going to give our predictions here in a second. But first, we want to talk about, you've been away. You went, I guess, on a vacation of some sort. This was a pleasure trip, right?
It was a pleasure trip. And if you've gone to Savannah and Charleston and Hilton Head, you know that eating there is the great pastime. And it's a wonderful place for food, for architecture, for history. We had a chance to be both in Georgia and in South Carolina. Georgia is very much a swing state. Savannah is sort of a blue dot in a red part of the state. We saw people canvassing. The ads are just more frequent there. One ad in particular was run by the National Rifle Association against Confiscation Kamala, which talked about her policies. It said, for the most part, she's hard to understand, but on gun confiscation, she's been very clear. And where does she get this idea? From the petri dish of bad ideas, California. And that ad was pretty constant across the radio. And we had an opportunity to then travel to South Carolina. You see a lot more yard signs and placards for Trump as you move up the coast to Charleston, right. A very historic city, a very beautiful city, also a little blue dot in a very red state. But, Charleston was the starting place of the Civil War. You could read on the plaques in the museum, on the storyboards. Following the election of 1860, because of Abraham Lincoln winning the election, the South felt their economic and critical interests were threatened and seceded from the Union. And, you could substitute 1860 for 2024, and that story might very much be the same. 40% of the country believed that if the other side won, that their economic interest and that their political interest would be so jeopardized that they did not want to be part of the country. And right now you've got two polarized sides here. And the other side, by the way, felt so strongly about the matter that they took arms to go attack the secessionists. As you study the history of this, you see the opportunities for off-ramps. You saw where if the city of Charleston had supplied the fort itself, Lincoln would not have needed to send a ship. If the South had taken either of the two deals, a constitutional amendment, which is being negotiated to protect slavery forever that couldn't be changed, or Lincoln's plan for long-term emancipation going to 1900 with compensation for slaves and relocation of them to Africa, the war would have been avoided. In fact, if the South had sent 500,000 old and enfeebled slaves to New York City and Chicago on the equivalent of buses and said, here you go with like $50 million, the Republican Party would have been wiped out in the next election. People would have said to hell with it. And abolition would take on the same odor that defund the police does today as long-term policy for 2 generations. None of that happened. What's interesting is that Lincoln's cabinet 3 times voted against resupplying the fort, and finally on the 4th time by 1 vote, they voted to do it, and that's what set off the war and caused 600,000 people to die. And what was breathtaking was just how close we are to the rhetoric of that time today. Now, we probably won't have a civil war, but the rhetoric is certainly just as amped up as it was back then. On one house, in the Evanston-Alston house, on the wall in the dining room, on one side was the Ordinance of Secession signed by everybody who was there. Alston himself did not sign it. He was a businessman and knew that the Civil War would have been bad for business. On the other side was his pardon that he received from President Andrew Johnson in 1867, pledging allegiance to the Union and agreeing not to be a Confederate anymore. So that stuff is still very much alive 150 years later.
Wow. The parallels are amazing. They really are. Well, that was a nice trip to take just prior to this election, without a doubt, to get a real new perspective on things. And thanks for sharing that with us. Okay, it's time to make the predictions. I guess I'll go first and say, I don't have a frickin' clue who's going to win. Just in the last week, I've swayed back and forth. Some of the things you brought up about Trump have made me think, well, maybe the Democrats still have a shot. So that part of it was optimistic for me, but all of this took place this last week. Prior to that, I was kind of thinking Trump had a shot at things. Now, I don't even know. So I leave it to my friend, my colleague, the man that I've spent 45 episodes with to lead me in the right direction as to who's going to win.
Well, Mike, all I can say is that you have demonstrated the wisdom of the ages because nobody knows how this election is going to turn out. A week ago, I said it looked like it was trending for Trump. I think his momentum has been blunted, and Harris has had a pretty good week, but not good enough to move decisively to an advantage. All of the battleground states are basically tied. The national vote is tied. I think Trump will do better in the popular vote, but will not get a majority. Nobody knows how these states are going to go out. So that means this is a turnout election. Who can get their vote out? Most people believe the Harris campaign has a better voter turnout operation than the Trump campaign, who outsourced it to private entities and organizations. And Harris campaign has probably spent their money better in terms of organization and get out the vote. So I will say, on the basis of mechanics, there is a good chance that the Harris campaign can pull this out. It will be very, very close and very, very tight, and it could go either way.
Wow. We kind of agree then, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which brings us full circle with what red versus blue is all about. Now, next week, we are going to be back next week. We don't know how many more episodes we're going to do, but we're definitely going to be back next week and clean up this mess. Hopefully we'll clean up this mess as to what's going on, right?
Well, but we have some more predictions to make because, as you know, the Senate is also in play.
Oh, right.
And I think the Republicans look to be holding on to both West Virginia and to Montana and have a reasonable shot in Wisconsin and Ohio. So I think the Republicans will take the Senate with at least 51 votes and probably 52. The House, however, I think is going to be a jump ball. It'll be, I think, plus or minus 4 or 5 seats. Either direction could go either way. The House is looking a little bit more favorable to the Democrats, but only by a seat or two from a week ago.
Wow. Well, it all gets determined this next week, hopefully. And then as we watch what goes on next week, we'll decide whether we're going to continue this. And I think we probably will, at least until it's completely settled. And we don't know when that will be. It could be January 20th of 2025, right?
Could be. Could be.
Great analysis today, Keith, taking us into this election. It's going to be an interesting few days. As soon as we're done here, I'm taking off my headphones and I'm going to just turn off all of the distractions, all of it, and just wait for Wednesday morning because it's really getting crazy out there. It's getting nuts. Both sides are just desperately trying to get those so-called independent votes. And it's hard to take it all in.
It is. Never has so much money been spent to pursue the votes of so few in American history.
Absolutely. All right. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe if you haven't. Go back and listen to the old episodes. Some good stuff in there. And we will see you again next week for another edition of Red versus Blue.
Bye, everybody. Go vote. Thanks.